This is Export, and in this video we are taking a look at the ASRock B650m PG Riptide. So I was looking for a motherboard for the R5-7600X, and in case you haven't noticed already, motherboard prices have gone way up compared to B450, for example, or even B550 at this point. So yeah, budget boards these days, they're around about 200 bucks. Now this thing actually comes in just shy of 200 bucks, and for that price you get a lot of features. You get a matx form factor, so this is not a full ATX board. The board is inside this computer right here, and I've been using it for a couple of months actually, and it's been okay, but we're going to talk about some of the features and stuff like that a bit later on. So the main reason I chose this board is because I have previously reviewed the B550M Pro 4 from ASRock, and I was actually quite impressed by the value for money for that board. And it actually, apart, I had to re-armate it because the audio jacks on the back end of the card stopped working. But apart from that, it has actually been pretty good. And it offered a lot of features for the money. So I figured I'd try ASRock again, because I saw that this board was seemed like one of the better budget boards. There are some competitors which we will get to a bit later on, actually at the end of the video, when we compare this to the competitors, and talk about which one you should be getting if you are looking at a cheap B650M motherboard or B650 motherboard. Now I was actually going to get the Wi-Fi edition, because you can get this with Wi-Fi, but I ordered the wrong board, so this one does not have Wi-Fi. And you might be thinking, oh, but what do you want Wi-Fi? What do you need Wi-Fi for? Wi-Fi is not really great. It's just a hardline cable is much better. That's true, and I am using cable with 10 gig, of course. I'm not using Wi-Fi, but I did want Wi-Fi because of the Bluetooth. And now you might be thinking, but Bluetooth, you can get a dongle. Yes, you can get a dongle, but a dongle will occupy one of the USB ports. And I happen to be using almost all the USB ports at this point, so I don't really have any USB ports to spare. It wouldn't be that much of an issue if I had a different case, but I don't. Now, next up, we are going to unbox the card. And well, I obviously already have unboxed it, but I did film it, so we're going to go through the unboxing and what you get in the box and stuff like that. So then, in the box with the motherboard, you do get a couple of accessories. So obviously you get SATA cables, a couple of SATA cables, and you also get a M.2 screw and a M.2 standoff. In addition to that, we have the user manual, might come in handy, and a card from ASRock. Not sure what you would do with that. AM5 install procedure, because this is obviously different than AM4, and yet another M.2 screw. Then we come to the good stuff, the motherboard itself. You do also get an ASRock badge that you can put on your PC if you so wish. And in the anti-static bag we do have the motherboard itself. The motherboard is in the anti-static bag and in some foam as well, so it seems to be well packaged. And you know, first impressions are that the build quality of the motherboard is pretty good, but of course it should be good, because it is also quite expensive. As you can see, they have used zip ties to secure the motherboard to the foam, so you do have to get a couple of pliers and cut those off. So having cut off the zip ties, we now get a better look at the motherboard. And as you can see here, it does have a permanent I/O shield, or a pre-installed I/O shield, I suppose that's what it's called. And yes, there are a lot of zip ties, and I didn't get them all. Build quality, as I said, is apparently pretty good. It feels pretty good, as it should, given the price. And of course, this is the first time AMD is using an LGA socket, so that is a bit different compared to the AM4 motherboards that we are more accustomed to. Now, let's take a look at some of the features of the boards and what you get like on the rear I/O and headers and stuff like that. If we start at the important back panel, at the top here we find the HDMI and DisplayPort. The HDMI port supports HDMI 2.1 and the DisplayPort supports version 1.4. Most of the new Ryzen CPUs have an integrated GPU this time, like Intel, so those ports can be handy when troubleshooting GPU issues. Then we have a BIOS flashback button. This is very handy when updating the motherboard without a CPU installed. And of course, if you're getting this board and want to install, say, a Ryzen 8000 or 9000 series CPU, you can update the board without having a 7000 series CPU. Then we find the USB Type A and Type C port. Both support 10 gigabit speeds, and ASRock notes that these are using redrivers. That can potentially mean that they have a higher latency. In other words, don't use these ports for your keyboard, mouse or gamepad. Next to that we find 4 USB 2 ports, and these are good for general purpose ports, USB headset, USB DAC, printers, lights and stuff like that. The next USB port are what ASRock calls Lightning gaming ports. These are supposed to have lower latency, although I doubt there is much in it. These support 5 gigabits per second, so lower bandwidth than the other ports, but lower latency, and 5 gigabits per second should be plenty for basically everything. You should use these for your keyboard and mouse. Then we have the LAN port that uses a 2.5 gigabit NIC from Realtek. In previous tests, Realtek have shown to be not quite up to par with Intel when transferring a large file to a NAS that can saturate the bandwidth, but for most people, including me, the Realtek NIC is just fine. Moving on to the audio ports, the motherboard uses a ALC 897 audio chip, which is lower end than the ALC 1200 the B550m Pro 4 uses, but I can't say that I could hear a difference between the two, and the audio solution was fine with all the headphones I tested, but I don't really have anything that is particularly difficult to drive. They sounded fine on my Sennheiser HD 559s and Sennheiser Momentums and Kingston HyperX headsets, so it will probably be fine with most headphones. If you want really good audio, I would suggest an external audio solution like a Topping E30, L30 combo, or even a Topping DX1 would easily outperform pretty much any onboard audio solution. So that wraps it up for the rear I/O. Let's move on to the onboard slots and headers. Starting with the obvious, for this generation AMD has opted to go for an LGA socket, similar to Intel. The mounting holes for the cooler are slightly different for AM5, so double check compatibility with your CPU cooler. Any cooler using the plastic tabs on the default AMD brackets will be just fine, including all Phenom 2 and FX stock coolers as well as Corsair AIO. This motherboard, and indeed all AM5 boards, have moved on to DDR5, and in usual AMD fashion there is a sweet spot in memory speed of 6000 MHz. This has official support for up to 6200 MHz with 4 DIMMs, and it supports expo profiles. Do note that the 6200 MHz with 4 DIMMs are only available with single-sided DIMMs, so not dual-rank DIMMs. The top M.2 slot has a sizable heatsink and supports PCIe 5.0 by 4 SSDs. The lower slot only has support for PCIe 4 by 4. That should be plenty though for the majority of use cases. The top PCIe slot is 16 lanes of PCIe 4.0, and this is where you will put in your GPU. And it comes with a standard metal armor to increase rigidity. But the 2 slots below are only 1 lane of PCIe 3.0 from the chipset. The nice thing about these slots though are that they do have a cutout on the rear end of the slot, allowing even GPUs to be installed, although you wouldn't want to do that due to the low bandwidth. I can't really think of a use case for this slot at this time, but I still thought it was a nice detail. The last slot is PCIe 4.0 by 4 coming from the CPU. And this slot is the one I'm using for my 10 gig NIC. This board has a total of 5 fan headers. All the headers apart from the CPU fan 1 header supports a power draw of 2 amps, while the CPU fan 1 header maxes out at 1 amp. So the CPU fan 1 you only want to install a fan, and the other ones you can possibly get away with a water pump on the other headers. We also have a total of 4 RGB headers on this board. One 12-volt RGB header, which maxes out at 3 amps for a total of 36 watts. And then we have 3 ARGB headers, which also support 3 amps current draw, but these headers run at 5 volts, which means power output is 15 watts per header. Personally, I would have tried the 1 or 2 RGB headers for an additional fan header, but I guess RGB headers can keep your PC cool as well. We also find 4 SATA ports on this motherboard. That should be enough for most people, as we are moving more and more towards M.2 storage. There is also a healthy amount of USB headers on the board. We get one Type-C header, and this is only a 5 gigabits per second header, but I guess that is good enough for most people, unless you have like an external M.2 SSD and transferring files to your other M.2 SSDs, or if you are using, I suppose, the CF Express cards for new cameras. Those could possibly also saturate a 5 gigabits per second USB port. So you may want to be looking to using at 10 gigabit ports for those, or maybe even at 20 gigabit ports, but this board doesn't have any 20 gigabit ports. We also have 2 of those less than stellar USB 3 headers. These are also 5 gigabits per second. Then you also find 2 USB 2 headers, which are useful for both USB ports, but also for AIOs and RGB controllers and stuff like that. Now a word on the aesthetics of the motherboard. I do like the black look of this board better than the silvery layout of the Pro 4, but of course that depends on your build and color scheme, and it's subjective. There is not a lot of RGB lighting on the board. The only RGB lighting can be found behind the chipset heatsink. Speaking of heatsinks, the VRM heatsink is actually of a decent size. So my personal experience with this board has been a bit of a roller coaster. My first boot up, it took a long time to post, and getting the memory settings dialed in also took quite a bit of time, because the sticks I'm using actually are, I think there are 6400 sticks, and the XMP profile or the Expo profile or whatever is on there does not work. So I can't get this to run at 6400. I can get them to run at 6000, but I have to manually input all the timings. Thankfully though, the DDR5 prices have dropped, and you can get decent speed DDR5 sticks now for slightly more than DDR4, but prices are coming down steadily, so I don't really think that DDR5 prices is going to be a big issue. So this board basically offers everything you need for a reasonable price, and the price will obviously probably go down as time goes on. The thing about this board though is it has some pretty fierce competition. So ASUS have some M.ATX boards, MSI has some M.ATX boards, and Gigabyte. So the Asus Prime boards, just honestly avoid them. They're not good value for money, and yeah, I don't think they look particularly good either. So just steer clear of those. Maybe the tough boards are okay, but they are more expensive as well, so do keep that in mind. MSI does have a B650M Pro-A board, but that also has some limitations. It has no PCIe 5.0, and it does not have a rear USB-C port. But other than that, it looks like a decent option. The biggest competition to this board is from Gigabyte, but it's not the DS3H, because the DS3H also has no PSI 5.0 port. It has weaker VRMs. They might be okay, but I would move out to the Elite or this board, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The Elite board looks a lot better, and it's around the same price as this board, and if I'm honest, I do think that the Aorus Elite B650M does offer more value for money than this board. You do get 20 gigabits per second on the front panel USB-C header, so that might be important if you are using a modern camera with a fast CF Express card or something like that. And it also has more rear USB ports. It has support for higher memory speeds on the QVL. It's just it offers more value for money, in my opinion. But this is a close second. So if you can't get the Aorus Elite, or this thing is cheaper where you live, maybe consider this. But my first choice would be the B650M Aorus Elite board, and then this board from ASRock. So basically, if I have to arrange the best value for money B650 boards, well, B650M boards, because those generally are the cheapest boards, it would be on first place the Gigabyte B650M Elite, and then there would be the ASRock PG Riptide, this board, and then maybe the MSI board, the Pro-A, or the Gigabyte DS3H. I would probably go for I would lean towards the MSI board, but the DS3H is maybe okay as well. So to sum up, the ASRock B650m PG Riptide, it offers good value for money, and it has everything you need for a modern AM5 motherboard, but it does face some pretty stiff competition from the Gigabyte Aorus Elite B650m motherboard, which would be my primary choice. But if you can get this board for cheaper than the Elite, maybe consider it. But especially if you do need that 20 gigabits per second front panel header, then obviously the Elite is the way to go. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.